I'm going to put two faces on the screen, and if you've clicked this video, I'm sure you'd know who this is. And pardon the pun, but I think there's a decent chance you won't know who this is. And that's not your fault. Until Xi Jinping, with perhaps the exception of North Korea's Kim's, the media focus put upon Eastern leaders was pretty minimal. However, the reality is that the reforms put in place by Chinese leaders were far more significant than any reforms made by a Western government. The Western systems were in place for centuries, whereas China's economic model has only been in place since the 1980s, and as a result, each leader's reforms drastically changed the system far more than in the West. And in today's video, we're going to meet the leader who brought China through the GFC to put their economy in a position that rivaled a breaking America. He's a leader you ought to know, so stick around to find out all about Hu Jintao.
Hello there.
Okay, it's great to be back for another China video, and my subscriber question for today is which of these has been your favourite characters of Communist China episodes so far? Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, Zhang Jing, or Chiang Kai-shek? Now, I'm not going to go through the complete backstory of Hu Jintao, but instead I'll jump straight to 1987. At this point, he'd risen within the party to become the boss of the province of Guizhou. However, his tenure was cut short as he was seen as not being firm enough with student protesters who were advocating for democracy. He was transferred out to Tibet and he learned his lesson. You see, in 1989, 3 months before the Tiananmen Square massacre, there were rioters, or protesters depending on whose side you were on, in Tibet's capital, Lhasa. Hu Jintao initially installed 1,700 extra police to try and quell the protests, but when this failed, he successfully persuaded Beijing to declare martial law and the military cleared out the streets. According to official reports, 5 people died in just 2 days, but Tang Daizhan, a former Chinese journalist, claimed that 469 Tibetans were in fact killed. Journalists were evacuated on March the 7th, just days beforehand, so we don't know exact numbers. Now, when the Tiananmen Square massacre came 3 months later, Hu declared his support for the government's actions. Jiang Zemin then took over as the new leader of China in 1989, and then in 1992 he was given the title of the President of the National Congress, a symbolic title more than anything. But this was important because it was going from a second generation of leadership to a third generation. Mao was first, Deng was second, and now Jiang was third. Think of it as going from Totodile to Mudkip. Now, the transition of the first generation to the second was chaotic, with Deng having to work hard to oust Mao's official successor, Hua Guofeng. Thankfully, this next transition had been easier, but Deng wanted to avoid a repeat of what happened in 1977, and so proposed sorting out the next transition right there and then. And so, based on a recommendation from Song Ping, Deng Xiaoping appointed Hu Jintao to the Politburo Standing Committee, the inner circle of leadership, making him the youngest member on the committee. Deng also vocalized that it'd be Hu who'd take over from Jiang in the future.
Soon I will have a new apprentice, one far younger and more powerful.
And so this actually happened as planned. In November 2002, Hu Jintao took over as General Secretary of the party. However, he initially did not enjoy quite as much power as Jiang Zemin had. Basically, Jiang Zemin still held on to the title of chairman of the military, and within the Politburo, Jiang still had his faction, the Shanghai clique. However, the strength of this faction weakened over time. For example, Zheng Qinghong went from being a member of the Shanghai clique to a facilitator between Jiang's and Hu's factions. Eventually, Hu would get the title of chairman of the military and he could begin his remodeling of China. And the reform that I want to begin with was called the 8 Honours and 8 Shames. Effectively, this was a set of moral principles targeted towards the youth. You see, the Maoist movement was an incredibly ideological movement, largely motivated out of principle. Deng's reforms in the 1980s were pragmatic and were needed to make a strong China with a functioning economy, but with this came rampant corruption as businesses sought to pay off party officials for favourable economic conditions like subsidies and tax exemptions. I obviously won't read out the whole thing, but those listed under the shame category were those who betray people, indulge in comfort and hate work, seek gains at the expense of others, and trade integrity for profits. A pretty clear dig at those who were corrupt. Now, it is worth saying that Hu's prosecution of the corrupt officials was fairly light, and it wouldn't be until 2013 that Xi Jinping executed Order 66. When it came to Hu's economic reforms, I'll split things into pre and post GFC. Firstly, he wanted to address the incredible wealth gap that existed between the rural and urban provinces. When Deng Xiaoping started the special economic zones over 2 decades beforehand, he said some would get rich first as the eastern provinces received tax cuts and government subsidies. So to even the distribution, Hu abolished land tax and rural school fees. Urban party officials also outnumbered rural officials 8-1, and so Hu restructured the system so that it would be 4-1. China also started to greatly invest in African infrastructure. Now, China had been funding African Marxist rebels since the 1950s, and for example, supported the Simba rebels in the Congo during the Congolese crisis. However, in the 2000s, it was clear that the African population was starting to rapidly grow, And going through decolonization, it was a pretty safe bet to assume that in the future world order, Africa would play the role that Europe played in the 19th century. And so, because of this, China started to invest in all sorts of infrastructure projects, such as the African Union Conference Center in Ethiopia. For the long-term future of China, having Greater Africa as an economic and strategic ally would be pretty OP.
Assemble.
And so now to look at how Hu managed the GFC. Now, full disclosure, I'm a history teacher and not an economics professor, so there is a bit of a ceiling here as to what I can give you for an event so recent. I had to read through a pretty dense government report on this one, and basically the main thing that Hu did was implement a $630 billion stimulus package in November of 2008, which made up about 14% of its 2008 GDP. In 2009, government expenditure would reach $1.2 trillion, and local governments were allowed to issue $31.5 billion worth of government bonds. Now, if this sounds like crazy expenditure, you'd be correct, but they were in a position where they could do this. Up until the stimulus package, the Chinese budget deficit had only been at 0.4%, and in 2007, they actually had a 0.4% surplus. It's also important to note that most of those stimulus packages were concentrated in infrastructure rather than industry. So China actually used the financial crisis to justify beginning building projects it had on the agenda, and in doing so, kept millions in employment. For this, Hu Jintao was given pretty wide praise, and China came out of the GFC nowhere near as scathed as the US did. And so finally, I'll finish with Hu Jintao's foreign policy. I think he was ultimately more flexible than most Chinese leaders were when dealing with Taiwan. However, he was adamant that the ultimate goal was still reunification. This changed in 2004 when the Democratic Progressive Party, which had more of an independent streak, won the election. Hu passed anti-sedition laws in 2005 which formalized non-peaceful means as a response to a potential Taiwanese declaration of independence. As part of its intention to destabilize the new DPP in Taiwan, Hu met with the chairman of the Kuomintang, Lian Chan, who was now in opposition. This was the first time a Kuomintang and Communist Party leader had formally met since Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong went to war back in the 1940s. When the KMT came back to power in 2008, Hu once again softened his approach to Taiwan. Unfortunately for Hu, though he led China through the GFC and at no point appeared incompetent, he just ran out of support from top-ranking Politburo members who instead voiced support for the vice president, Xi Jinping. Hu was hoping that his ally, Li Keqiang, would take over, but in the build-up to November of 2012, Xi Jinping went on strike, cancelling meetings with Hillary Clinton in Singapore in order to get his top picks in the Politburo. Nonetheless, unlike Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao immediately gave Xi Jinping control of the military commission, and this was seen as a message to his predecessor that you don't meddle with the dealings of your successor. Thanks for watching. If you did like this video, that's great, but to truly understand the rise of China, you have to check out these videos on Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.